What's up, everybody? Another episode of Ripple Effect Podcast. Remember to subscribe to us on iTunes and Stitcher Radio and our YouTube channel and all that stuff, and follow us on Twitter to keep up with each upcoming guest. And today we got Eric Draitser. He, I hope I said your name right. And he's a political analyst. He's been on a lot of different things that I've seen him on, like RT, Breaking the Set. He's been on James Corbett's show. He's done some work for Boiling Frog Post with Sibel Edmonds, and so he's really knowledgeable. And with all the international news going on and stuff, he really knows his history about all these countries, and that's kind of your best way of kind of understanding what causes these conflicts. So I just want to thank Eric for being with us today.
Thanks for having me, Ricky. It's my pleasure.
Hey, thanks for being with us. Hey, let's get into for people who don't know, you do a podcast, right? Are you still doing the Sibel Edmonds podcast for Boiling Frog?
Well, the podcasting thing has been somewhat of a hiatus recently, I guess. I've just been a bit busy with some of my other things that I'm doing, not just in terms of my writing and the appearances and so forth, but just other things going on in my life that have made it real difficult. My podcast, it's long and it's time consuming, and I haven't quite been able to fit it into my schedule. But yes, I do a podcast, and yes, it will return at some point in the near future. All of my work is on my website, stopimperialism.org. There you'll find my written work, that is my articles. You'll find my appearances on media, RT, Press TV, many other places as well. And generally it's sort of a clearinghouse for everything that is mine.
Yeah. So if basically that's where I actually see a lot. You post all your appearances on RT, and then all like you said, all the places you can just get all that on your website, and basically you don't have to go searching for it or whatnot. So definitely check that out. And so let's talk a little bit about what we were talking about before we start recording, because it's kind of it's fun to kind of talk to other people who do podcasts and stuff like that. And we're kind of bullshitting a little bit about the idea of once you hit record on podcasts, do you start second guessing what you're saying a little more? Do you because it seems like it's hard to, at least from my experience, and I've definitely gotten better at it, but I just going back and listening to old shows, I would catch myself with, like, especially James Corbett. He was our first real guest, and I remember just like all of a sudden I'm like, I hit record and I have a guest, and I'm just like, what is wrong with me? I'm like, I usually never have a problem with talking or whatnot, and then all of a sudden I can't gather my thoughts and whatnot. And you were saying how what helped a lot was the fact that you do these super long podcasts and did you do it all one take?
Yeah, I record it live, so to speak. The only pauses I would take would be between segments, which is where I would drop in musical interludes. But yeah, I would do it in one take, and sometimes it would go, usually it would go 2.5 to 3 hours at least. And just because I'm just such a klutz when it comes to trying to cut segments and trying to limit the length of the podcast, I'd want to talk about Turkey and Pakistan and Congo and Venezuela and all of these other things, and it would become the sprawling podcast. And so I think that getting back to kind of what you were alluding to, it forced me into sort of a mode of thinking, not just thinking on my feet, but being comfortable with myself and being comfortable with speaking into a microphone in a monologue fashion. And I think one of the main things about that is you have to sort of allow your own personality to come through. And once your personality really begins to come through, that's when you start to notice the little idiosyncrasies in your manner of speaking, the places where you stumble, where you fumble over language or whatever. And pretty soon those things become eliminated, and it becomes much more free-flowing and much more, what's the word I'm looking for? Without as many errors, I guess.
Yeah. I had Dan Carlin on, and he's kind of known for his long podcasts and stuff too. But he does them. He kind of, I think he used to do them a lot more without any real editing, but now he does a lot of editing, and he'll go as long as he can until he like tires out. Then he'll do some more and whatnot.
Yeah.
And
Dan Carlin's the man. Hardcore History is a great show. I don't get a chance to listen to what's the other one? Common Sense as much as
I like Common Sense. Yeah,
I do too. I just to be honest with you, I was listening to a lot. I was in a mode of listening to a lot of podcasts. On the subway to and from work, and just walking around the city and so forth. But I don't know. Recently, I've kind of dropped listening to podcasts as much, and I've been trying to focus back on reading more and spending my time on the trains reading more books as opposed to listening to podcasts. And I don't know how people do it, but people who seem to be listening to things and reading at the same time, it doesn't make any sense to me.
Yeah, I'm not sure how they do that either. Like people with headphones while they're reading,
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure they can't consume all that information. I mean, I have a hard time doing just one of them and consuming the information. So
But
doing,
what I will say about Dan Carlin though is that part of what makes Hardcore History a great show is the high level of production. And I think part of that is because of his professional background and the people he works with and so forth. And that's something that people like you and me, who are kind of one man shows, who are not really. I shouldn't speak for you. I don't know your background, but my background is certainly not in production, audio production, anything like that. So for us, it's kind of a DIY situation, sort of. I guess you could call it a punk rock podcasting style.
yeah, yeah. Well, with me, the only thing that I did have some experience in is that I do music. I do a music project called Theory Six. I grew up playing music and whatnot, and that was kind of my first thing that I understood how to use Pro Tools and software and stuff like that. And I already had some microphones and headphones. So then basically I was just trying to get this music out. And as I got older, it got more politically, I guess influenced. I guess when you're young, you really think, you write songs about personal issues which you think are huge, which is like relationships and stuff like that, and trying to find your way in life, and you're trying to find fulfillment to some sense. And then as I got older and I started getting more into podcasts, more into documentaries, more into a bunch of other stuff that kind of just helped me realize that holy shit, there's some issues out there that seem way more important than my own personal ones,
Yeah.
and definitely way bigger. And then it slowly got more political and more about I guess marketing and wars and all that type of stuff. And then it just got to a point where doing music, I do music all on my own, because being in a band, when it's almost impossible to keep everybody together, everybody has their own priorities and stuff. So I guess the one good thing about doing podcasts on our own like we do is that we kind of go at our own pace, and we, if it doesn't get done, we have nobody to blame except ourselves. So that's definitely a plus, that I can't be like, oh shit, we missed another band practice because what's his
Yeah.
face couldn't make it. And so that's definitely a good thing. But and then I just felt like I needed to get, I felt like I could do more, and I felt like podcasting was a great way, and I was a fan of podcasts. Some of the early ones, I've been a Rogan fan for a long time, and James Corbett, and a bunch of the early ones I started listening to, and Dan Carlin, and then I'm just like, that's a more rewarding, a quicker way of getting a reward, and getting some information out than writing a whole song and putting it all together and all whatnot. So that's how it came about and whatnot. How did, on the subject, because now that I'm ranting and on the subject, how did you come about it? Have you always been really interested in history and stuff like that? Well, you live in what, Brooklyn?
Yes,
And
I live
yeah,
in Brooklyn.
so that's probably why you're in geopolitics, because Brooklyn has somebody from every country in the world. Like everybody's represented in New York. So you probably
Well, I will say I'm not a native New Yorker. I'm originally from California actually, but I've been here for about 10 years. I've always had an interest in these things, though my academic pursuits have been distinctly varied. I have a bachelor's degree in art history. I have a master's degree in creative writing and poetry. I have a second master's degree in education. So I've been a teacher. I've worked in art museums. I've done a lot of different things. But in terms of history and political affairs and current affairs and things like that, I mean, I've been interested in that stuff for as long as I can remember. And I mean, these things just evolve over time, and your interests change. And I was when I was a kid, I was really interested in the news. I always liked watching the news and reading newspapers and stuff at a pretty young age. As I got older, and in my teenage years, I was more into artistic pursuits and literature and poetry and hip hop and all kinds of different things. And that kind of carried me through to college. And then since then, I've kind of, gravitated more towards nonfiction and political issues and things like that. And now I'm sort of trying to come into my own in terms of mixing all of these different things together. But it's difficult. I mean, the world never stops being a messed up place. I was going to say fucked up. I guess I can say that
Yeah,
on
you can
here.
say that. Yeah.
Um, the world never ceases to be fucked up, and there's always going to be problems, and there's always going to be conflicts. And I feel like we live in a particularly volatile moment in history. And, so I feel uniquely situated to provide a perspective that is different, that is unique, that is certainly something that will never come through in Western corporate media, or really corporate media in general. And I feel fortunate that I started doing this at a time that all of these things were coming together. I suppose I was a little late to the game in the podcasting realm, but just as podcasts were growing and social media had really kind of come into its own and so forth, I sort of got into all of this. So, I guess that's a long way of saying that, I've grown into this, I've evolved into this, and I hope to, continue evolving. One of the things that I spent some time doing in the last couple of years, although I've fallen off on it recently, was studying Kung Fu. And one of the central tenets of Kung Fu is this notion of learning without limit, that everyone from the youngest child to the oldest sifu or master or teacher is always learning, that it's a constant process of learning and a constant process of evolving. And I take that very much to heart. And I think of that as sort of a guiding principle for me in all the things that I do, podcasting and political work included.
Yeah, yeah, and all those things. It's funny how like all those little hobbies you're into, and all those, all those. When you meet somebody, you end up learning more about their other hobbies, and like all that stuff has an influence on the way you look at things, or how modest a person is, or her, and stuff like that. So I think it's arts and all that stuff is so important. You being a teacher, it's funny because I had Daniele Bignelli on a while ago. I think it was last year I had him on, but he was a professor and martial artist and whatnot, and we started talking about, the education system, and, just basically how, he believes that the one of the big issues, and I agree with him, that people just feed you information and they don't tell you how it relates to your life. Because growing up, I was never really into history and whatnot. And then after high school, and I kind of just started doing my own research and watching documentaries and stuff, I became obsessed with it. I would learn a little bit about the Ireland conflicts, and I wanted to know everything about the IRA, and then I learned a little bit about Palestine and Israel conflict, and I'm just like, I wanted to learn everything about that, and I'm just like, why wasn't I into this when I was younger? And it was because they didn't tell you, why it was important. They didn't tell you how it relates to today, and you being into, being a teacher, is that what do you see as the issue? Do you think it's because the teachers don't have enough freedom, or do you think that is just, from your perspective, what do you think is the issue with, not getting kids to engage?
Well, there's a number of things, and I always stress this to people that education, there's a difference between education as a concept and education as a field. They're two very different things, because education as a concept, when you're talking about pedagogy, that is the study of learning and the art, and I do think that it is an art in many ways of teaching people. This is one thing, and you can speak of that in a general sense. But there's a very different thing, and that is the social practice of education. That is something that has to integrate many different aspects of our society. And my experience in teaching, I worked in inner city schools here in New York City. I taught in Harlem, I taught in East Brooklyn, and I dealt with a particularly difficult population of young students, primarily students of color. And they had a very distinct set of challenges that are certainly not the case for, what I would call, middle class, affluent white students in the suburbs, even 20 miles away here on Long Island or in Westchester or wherever. And the set of issues and difficulties are distinctly different, and issues of engagement are distinctly different. You have students who come to you, some of them very, very bright, but lacking certain basic skills, others completely disengaged for many different reasons, and some openly hostile. And there are many different ways that you have to negotiate these things and mitigate these various factors. And so I always kind of take a step back when people want to sort of and I'm not suggesting you're doing this, but many people do want to broad brush education in this sort of very general sense. And I think that it's a nuanced issue. For instance, one of the particular issues that is facing education right now is an issue of capitalism, that is to say, privatizing public education and commodifying it, making students into customers and into consumers of information. And that goes all the way down the line, not just from the teachers, but also to administrators and politicians and corporate bureaucrats and others and hedge fund operators who are pushing a privatization agenda. And that has a trickle down effect. So you hear people talking about things like the Common Core standards. And why do those Common Core standards exist? Why do standardized tests exist? It is to commodify education. And see, these are issues that are fundamental to understanding the current state of education. And it is not simply a matter of, well, is the content that you're teaching relevant? I think that any teacher who's a decent teacher struggles very hard on a daily basis. I know I did. I know every colleague of mine who was genuinely interested in teaching and in having students learn always looked to engage students with things that were relevant to their daily lives and relevant to their own culture and to their social situation and communities and all of that. But that's not the only issue that you're dealing with. You're also dealing with a system, and all systems, especially such vast and overarching systems such as a system of education that exists, are going to be complex, and there's going to be competing factors and competing interests. And so I don't know if I'm really answering your question, but I'm just saying that a holistic understanding of how education works and how it operates is really important. And so getting back to this idea of why you're not taught the things that you're supposed to be taught, well, it's very simple. Anybody who's ever encountered Michel Foucault and the theory of power and how power works, power is never going to cede its power to the powerless. There are power relations that are at play. I know your friend James Corbett, and my friend and colleague as well, talks a lot about Jeremy Bentham and the panopticon, and how the panopticon and the surveillance state is very much intertwined with education and the way that education operates. And all of that is true. But at the same time, when you think about all of the other factors, the economic factors, the political factors, and the social factors that are attempting to deprive many people and many populations of access to education, these things must also be taken into account so that you can have a really macro understanding of the concept.
Do you think do you subscribe to the idea that it's on purpose for the sake of stopping, it's not accidental that they're not provoking critical thinking and imagination, and they're straying away from arts and anything that kind of gets people to kind of look at things from different perspectives and whatnot, and for the purpose of making people just kind of consuming zombies who will just go to work and be materialistic and buy stuff and whatnot? Do you think that it is on purpose, or I guess I don't want to go into the whole NWO, but I mean, I guess we're kind of leading there. I mean, do you think that there is some type of dumbing down in effect?
Well, yes, that's certainly an aspect of it, but I don't think that one can reduce it to that level, because look, I mean, if you're talking about public education, see, education is an abstraction. Education as a field even is really an abstraction. I mean, education, you could go back to Thomas Aquinas and the theory of education and the student as a sponge who's supposed to simply absorb knowledge that is dispensed to them. You could bring that forward to the industrial age and the need to make workers and a working class that would be fit for a pool of labor. You could bring that forward to today and talk about the lack of critical thinking as being part of the commodification of education. Part of the reason why critical thinking and arts and all these things are systematically being removed from education is because they are difficult and, in fact, in many ways impossible to quantify. And it is quantifying these things that is at the fundamental root of what it means to commodify them. You cannot commodify something that you cannot count. You cannot commodify something that you cannot make into a profitable product. And so things like when they say math and science are the thrust of everything we want to do, part of the reason is because they force teachers to generate data, sets of numbers by which students can be evaluated. Why? Because those sets of numbers fit very neatly into a commodification process, from the creation of standardized testing to the creation of standards by which all students, regardless of their situations, their different learning styles, and all these other things, by which they can be measured. And so there is certainly a process of dumbing down a population, but there's also a process of capitalizing upon that population. And there are actually a number of other processes that we probably don't have time to go into that I think factor into this. And all of these things, I think, need to be included in a sort of a holistic understanding of why education is the way it is. Remember, there are many systems of education that are all at play as we speak. There is public education. There is a currently moving towards a privatized education through charter schools and many other institutions. And there's fully private education. There is religious education. There is homeschooling education. Many different kinds of education, each of which have their own flaws, their own drawbacks, but also their own benefits. And I certainly reject anybody who says that public education is entirely negative, because if they believe that, then they have absolutely zero understanding of the real world and the way that the real world works. Because for many people, in fact, for most people throughout the last 100 years, public education has been access to something, access to upward social mobility that otherwise they would never have had access to. Remember that many of the people who speak ill of public education, they think that somehow 100 years ago education was better, that the standards were better. Remember that 100 years ago it was white males of affluent privilege, and only white males of affluent privilege, who had any true access to higher education, to institutions of learning and institutions of knowledge. There's been a 100-year process of widening that access. So this is why I reject the idea that education in the last 100 years or in the last 50 years is decidedly worse than it used to be. That's in my opinion, that's a generally reactionary position that those, mostly conservatives, but not exclusively conservatives, somehow espouse. And I think that is ahistorical in many ways, and it really flies in the face of a nuanced understanding of the trajectory of modern education.
Yeah, yeah, and I think that if you look at it, the society's as weak as its weakest link. I think that everybody having just the ability to have a decent education is important for, I know a lot of people just look at it as, a libertarian type view, or just like, you shouldn't help the poor. Everybody has the right to work and let the market do it, do its own thing and whatnot. But I just feel like, we have to look at society as, we don't want people who are dumb and homeless. I mean, I know some people are against minimum wage and raising it and whatnot. And regardless of what your point of view is on all those issues, I think that we have to look at it as, if you want to live in a safe and progressing society, we have to look at, okay, the less, dumb people, I guess, for lack of a better term, and not always because it's their fault, because I think that a lot of people are just not exposed to good schools, or not exposed to anybody around them, or good books, or anything that influence them in a positive way. And it actually reminds me of the book, The Straight A Conspiracy. It's about the idea that we're all, for the most part, we're all capable of being intelligent and consuming information and putting ideas together. It's just how many of us have access to good books. That's why I'm a big Aaron Swartz fan. Who rest in peace, because he committed suicide. But a guy who believed in putting out information. And I'm a big Michael Sandel fan, the Harvard professor who put a whole semester online. For his philosophy course, and they believe in putting out information and people having the ability to learn. It shouldn't be just for the people who can afford it. I mean, like Harvard or whatnot, and they to have all the best education, and if you can't afford it, then too bad. So it just I definitely agree with a lot of the points you made, and I think that questioning what education is, and looking at things from not just what we're conditioned to believe this works and that doesn't, but questioning even what works is important. And you're right. There's probably negatives and positives about public education and making it private and homeschooling and all that stuff. I mean, you can kind of take something away from it that makes sense. But in your opinion, do you feel like we could still fix it? I mean, do you feel like, I mean, how do you fix public education when the money's going to the wrong places? We're not spending any money. I mean, we'll complain about poor areas that there's crime, this and that, but yet we don't spend any money there. I mean, we could rebuild Detroit with all the money we spend in Iraq. It's just is that an issue? It's just that they're neglecting the areas that need a little bit more love and care.
Well, fixing public education is something that we couldn't even scratch the surface on in 10 part installment of our interviews here. But I think that at a very basic level, you're hitting at an important point, and that is that the privatization movement that I've mentioned. Well, let me just give you my own personal experience. The privatization that I'm talking about, the outline that I've been outlining here, is really occurring primarily in the major cities and in primarily low-income urban neighborhoods, primarily to communities of color. And the reason is quite simple: because they demonize those schools and they demonize the education system there as being broken and being in need of being fixed. Of course, who is doing the fixing and what is the fix that they're proposing? See, this is the part that they always conveniently leave out. And my friends on the libertarian right, many of whom I have very close relations with in terms of geopolitical views and so forth, but in my judgment, conveniently leave out the fact that it is a so-called market driver that is pushing this. That is to say, the power of finance capital, that which they believe is somehow supposed to be resolved by the market. They're the ones that are driving this. It is Wall Street, it is finance capital, the hedge funds, and all of the big banks, and all of the foundations, and all of these various institutions that represent Wall Street. They're the ones who push the privatization movement. Why? Because they are the ones who stand to gain from it. It is the major education corporations, the scholastics and the others, who are making billions, literally billions of dollars off of this movement. And what is it that they need to do? They need to, quote unquote, remake and reform public education. But when they say reform, what they mean is capitalize. That is, turn it into profit. Remember, public education, this is not an industry like, service industry. That's what they want to make it into. They want students to be customers because they believe that that is somehow the ideal form of social organization, which I can tell you just from my own experience, it is not. Students are not customers and teachers are not employees. Teachers are educators and students are learners. And that's something that is very, very different. And it cannot be resolved with some kind of non-existent fictional abstraction like market factors and market drivers and all of the rest of this. And I would say also that there is a fundamentally racist ideology at work there as well, because if you look at many of these forces that are driving it, they don't want these forces touching their affluent schools in the suburbs. They don't want them touching it in Greenwich, Connecticut, or in the North Shore of Long Island or anywhere else. But sure, it's fine for the kids in Harlem, for the kids in Canarsie, Brooklyn, for the kids in Brownsville or in the South Bronx. It's fine for them. And this is part, I think, very much built into the fabric of the United States. We've seen this over the course of multiple generations, just the way that this is done. And I mean, we could cite hundreds of examples of the deliberate targeting of these type of populations. So I think, like I said, there's many factors that go into this, but again, commodification is something that is very important. Remember that, and I don't know whether many listeners have ever read Marx's Capital, but if you haven't, you absolutely should, because whether you like or hate or are indifferent to Marx, it is a fundamental critique of how capitalism works. And where does Marx begin? Not with the market, not with profit, not with value. He begins with the commodity, and the commodity as being the mode of exchange between individuals within a capitalist system. And it is commodification. That is the process that people need to be aware of. As things get commodified, systems build around those commodities, and that is the fundamental point about education reform.
Yeah, I definitely agree, and I think people have to look at private prisons. You know, what does that cause? That causes more people to get locked
The
up.
same exact forces. The exact same forces that I'm talking about with education, precisely the same with prison. And quite frankly, it's not, the school to prison pipeline is a well-known, well-established fact. Michelle Alexander's famous book, the New Jim Crow, which I don't love everything that Michelle Alexander has said. I've seen her be quite the Obama apologist. But that being said, her point is well taken. And the school to prison pipeline, the reason why primarily students of color wind up in inordinate numbers in prisons is absolutely part of that same commodification. And one could view it, I think, with very real certainty as being an extension of modern slavery. It absolutely is, and I don't think that's an overstatement at all.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree, and I've heard people state it that way, that it kind of, the way you and the war on drugs is a perfect example of that. They have
Absolutely,
they
yes,
it's all linked together, and it's a
yes.
perfect way of how you can put people who are nonviolent criminals and have an excuse to lock them up, and it's amazing. Yeah, I mean, it's like you said, it's all linked together, and I think it's a problem because we went from, and to quote Michael Sandel, we went from a market economy to a market society where everything is for sale, and it just he told the story once in an interview about, I think, some California prison that you can pay $80 a day, and you can be upgraded to a nicer cell or something like that. And he's just like, look what the world's turning into, where everything's for sale, everything's a statistic, and I think that's the issue. I think we can't keep going down the road of everything's for sale and everything's a statistic. We have to look at.
Well, I do think that ultimately that is the end result of a worship of a non-existent abstraction called the market. I think that is absolutely the logical end result of that. And I think that this is where I part ways with my libertarian friends, whom I find a lot of similarities with. But this I would call it a quasi-religious belief in markets, which again, you don't have any historical examples of that. It's the same problem I have with my anarchist friends, anarchists on the left or on the right or wherever, who talk about anarchism but can't really point to an example of a system built along anarchist lines that works. That is to say, that actually functions and is able to defend itself against the true forces of power. So again, I mean, and I don't mean to send us off on a complete tangent here, but my point is that the belief in these sorts of systems, or lack thereof, I think is a fundamental flaw and really a fallacy in a lot of people's ideology. I think that rather than looking at the market as something that's supposed to resolve issues, one should really be interested in what the market is and who controls it and why, and how do they control it? How do they exercise power over this fictional abstraction called the market? And then you get at the root of what it really is: a ruling class, whatever you want to call it, a new world order, Illuminati, ruling class, imperial establishment, whatever. You call it what you will, but when you get at that root and you understand how it functions, how it operates, and what its means of power are, and how it subjugates the rest of us, that is when you start asking, I think, the critical questions. And this is my point of sort of congratulations, I guess, for lack of a better word, to Occupy. That Occupy made a lot of tactical mistakes, and I was there at the very beginning, 10 days after Occupy started here at Zuccotti Park in New York, and but the one thing that they really did hammer home, the notion of the 1%, and of course we're really talking about the 0.000001%, that idea of a ruling class is fundamental to understanding how all of these systems work. The drug war and for-profit education and for-profit prisons and all of these issues, all of that, and the wars and the profiteering and all of the rest of it, all of the issues that we're going to talk about, all of that is part of this ruling class, and I think it needs to be understood exactly in that way. And if you miss that point, then you're missing the key aspect of how power works in the modern world.
Yeah, well, you make a good point about the libertarians because I'm a big Ron Paul fan, and I think for the most part I agree with a lot of libertarian views. The whole idea of decriminalizing drugs and smaller government and stop spending so much on offensive wars instead of defensive wars. And I agree with a lot of that stuff. But I think what ends up happening is people pick teams, and it's like you hear debates with with Adam Kokesh and somebody else, or Peter Joseph and somebody else, and about their philosophies, and it's just like I think we all have the same goal. We have the same purpose. Our intentions are good. At least I hope they are. That we all think that we have a philosophy that we've decided that would work. And I think that the point is we all agree that the one that we have, the economy and the way things are today doesn't work. And so I think that everybody's intentions are there. But I think the problem with, and that's what I like what you said, that you kind of agree with libertarians up to here, because I think that that's something that a lot of people aren't able to do. Once they pick a team, once they pick, I'm a libertarian, I'm a this, I'm a that, next thing you know, it's like they have to agree with them with almost everything. And I feel like there's a lot of good things out of a lot of different philosophies and a lot of different ways of running a market. And but like you said, I'm not even sure a completely free market, or even an anarchist type of libertarian view where you just kind of let the markets regulate themselves. I'm not sure we have any example in history of that ever working or
No,
ever even happening.
It's a fiction. I don't know any other way to say that, and I'm sorry if it hurts anybody's feelings, but this is an utter fiction. This is something that is designed by very powerful and wealthy people to perpetrate it on the rest of us to justify their reactionary ruling establishment views. And I mean, we could go into the long and sordid history of where all of these ideas come from and who the Austrian school is and who funded them and why and how they were related to the Habsburgs and the ruling the ruling class in Europe and where they were funded from. I could do that for hours, but for in the interest of time and whatever, the point is that the notion that I think is fundamentally flawed in their conception of the world is that that the only inalienable right is the right of property, that property rights trump all other rights. And I fundamentally reject that view. Not only do I reject it just on its face, I reject it on a moral level, I reject it on an ethical level, on a philosophical level, on a political level, every level I could think of, I reject that. Human rights trump property rights, and they always do. Remember that property rights were the basic platform of the slave owning class leading up to the Civil War and during the Civil War. They had no interest in any rights beyond property rights, and that includes human rights. So they saw the slaves as their property, and anyone who would violate the sanctity of property this is an outrage, dear sir, an outrage, I tell you. This is lunacy. And I think that the idea of the inalienable right of property, first of all, we should also be very clear. Those anarchists of the libertarians, I guess libertarian's probably not even the right word, but anarcho-capitalist is really the word that Murray Rothbard and the rest of these types coined. These anarcho-capitalists love to talk about the inalienable right of property above all else, and yet they rail against the state when it is the state which is the only institution that can guarantee the right of property. property, because without a state, there can be no contract, there can be no property, that is to say, inalienable right of property. So it's a sort of a catch-22, and I find it to be particularly ridiculous. And to be honest, I wasn't expecting to talk about all of these subjects with you, but since we've gone in this direction, it's something that I think, and I speak only from my personal opinion, it has to be rejected, that rights exist far above property, and anybody who believes that property is the only right there is, well, I can't respect them.
Well, that's what I love about podcasts, because I get people all the time asking me, they're like, "Oh, what are you going to talk about?" Just to kind of be a little prepared. I'm like, dude, I don't. Usually, I have some ideas, and sometimes we go so far away from that, and I don't stop it, because that's usually when you get the best conversations, when you're just kind of, just talking about your own personal experiences and views and opinions, and then you get the gem, that way, instead of having kind of a Q&A type thing. So wherever the fuck the podcast goes, that's fine. We could talk about hip hop if you want, but
Well, like, let me just, I would just say that, does anybody doubt the moral justification of expropriating the land of a plantation owner and distributing it among slaves? Now, that's one example, and I'm not suggesting that's a perfect situation, and there's many problems with that. But just since we're talking on a theoretical level, I think that there's absolute moral justification for that type of thinking. And if there is, then one must immediately ask the question: is the right of property truly inalienable? I would answer no, it is not inalienable. And I would say that there are rights that supersede that. And that, I don't love Abraham Lincoln. I have a lot of problems with Abraham Lincoln, and we could go into the history of why that is. But that is one of the principal points that he did drive home through the Emancipation Proclamation and through many of the statements that he made, was that notion, that's inalienable right of property, particularly of white humans to own non-white humans, that this is absolutely it's inhuman, and inhuman is really the only word I can think of. And it's no coincidence why those who believe in the inalienable right of property above all else, it oftentimes, not exclusively, but oftentimes identify very closely with the roots of the Confederacy, and it goes back a long, long, long way. And we could talk about their quote unquote distrust of the civil rights movement and the John Birch Society and all of the things that they were publishing against Martin Luther King as a communist agitator and conspiracy, and all of the rest of this. This is all a knee-jerk reaction against this move away from that line of thinking, which to a large extent has infiltrated the so-called Republican Party in the United States. Remember that after Franklin Roosevelt and the sort of flip-flop of the major parties, it was the Republican Party that threw its doors open to the former racist Democrats, and it fundamentally changed the nature of the Republican Party. And I think that the radical right wing of the Republican Party is very much a part of that historical tradition.
Yeah, yeah. Well, you when you learn a little bit about history, it's funny, because growing up, I was such I kind of went more to the Democratic side, just because of the fact that I agree with the social issues. And then as I did my research, I'm like, holy shit! Everybody that I thought was like a good president and didn't have many skeletons in their closets, I was wrong, And I just had Roger Stone on, well, I think last Friday or something like that, and the political consultant and the author now, and he worked for Nixon and Reagan, and he's considers himself a libertarian now, and but boy, he still has those ties to the Republican Party, because he would just go off bashing Kennedy and a lot of the things he did make sense, and LBJ and all this stuff. But we talk about Nixon, and you could tell that he just he wouldn't bash him, and it just it was just I'm like Nixon.
And what's funny about that is that by comparison to Barack Obama, Nixon is an ultra liberal.
Oh, you're right. A lot of people have said that. Yeah, Obama is, if I think, the situation with Obama is, at least from my experience and people that I've talked to surrounding me, I think that he's fucked up so bad that even people who supported him they just can't deny that he's done nothing. He hasn't nothing he's promised he's done. He's constantly trying to cause conflicts with now Russia. He wanted to get in Syria, and I wanted your take on that because about that because I've it's been a topic that's come up a lot with guests because obviously it's an important and news going on right now, but what's your take on what do you think it is? Because I've heard people talk about that. We're just trying to, I guess, justify some defense spending by causing conflict with Russia or whatnot. I mean, why would they be, I guess, poking at them the way they are? From your take, I'm sure it's obviously a lot more complicated than that. But
Sure. Yeah, I mean, it is certainly complicated, and this is not the Obama administration exclusively. Remember that I mentioned earlier in our conversation here. The issue is a ruling class. It is a ruling establishment, and that ruling establishment and its operatives go across all political lines, and they go across presidential administrations, and the bureaucrats and the apparatchiks, they work from one administration to the next quite seamlessly, which is why anybody who believed that Obama was going to be hope and change is an utter fool. And I mean, I don't mean to be crass about it at this point. I suppose some were just naive, and some were unwitting dupes, and others are just perfectly happy to go along with the status quo. But the reality is that this is a long-standing policy, and we could go at least back to the end of the Soviet Union and the agreement that was reached between the West and the Soviet Union, and Gorbachev specifically, when he had that agreement with George H.W. Bush that the Soviet Union would dissolve, but that NATO would not expand eastward. And of course, as soon as the Soviet Union dissolved, that's exactly what NATO did, expanding eastward and absorbing the Baltic states, absorbing Georgia, creating a de facto colony in Kosovo. All these things I've talked about before, but just for your listeners who may not be familiar with my position on this long-standing policy, many foreign policy experts and international relations gurus, George Kennan and many others, said that this was an absolutely insane policy, that eventually it would elicit a backlash from Russia. And that is precisely what we've seen in the last 14 years since Putin has come to power. Putin's principal worldview is that the expansion of NATO and the expansion of U.S. and Western hegemony is an existential and imminent threat to Russia. And I agree with that. That is precisely what the U.S. and NATO have attempted to do. And Ukraine is really the latest and most egregious example of that. And sure, it's about justifying defense spending, but that is, like, in my opinion, as overly simplistic and reductionistic as saying that Libya was a war for oil. I mean, to say that is to reduce an incredibly complex issue to essentially one single simple-minded talking point. I reject that sort of reductionistic analysis. I think that rather what you need to think about is the idea that the expansion of NATO is an imperial strategy, and it is an imperial strategy that if you want to look at some of the principal architects of that strategy, go read The Grand Chessboard by Zbigniew Brzezinski. He lays it out pretty clearly in 1997 exactly what that strategy would be: the encirclement of Russia, the containing of China, and using the traditional Soviet spheres of influence against Russia to menace Russia and ultimately to break Russia apart. That is the ultimate goal here. And I think that Putin understood that from the very beginning. And Putin is no fool. I think anybody, even his biggest detractors, understand that. And so what we've seen in Ukraine, I think, is really a gross miscalculation, not just by the Obama administration, but also by the neocons. Remember, the neocons are still very much in power. They have a lot of influence in policy circles. They have a lot of influence inside of government institutions. And, John McCain being one of their more batshit crazy spokespeople. But what they've been doing in Ukraine is part of this long-standing policy, and Russia's counter move, specifically in Crimea, has really thrown them for a loop. And now they're all running scared because now they realize that you keep poking at Russia and Russia's going to fight back. And that's precisely what we've seen.
Yeah, yeah. And one thing you learn, when you do your research on history and whatnot, like our foreign policy has been well thought out and everything is a strategy for something. It's not, we always, they sell the public the idea that we're going to help this country or we're going to help these rebels or whatnot. And we really don't care about any of that shit. It's all about, I remember when I watched a documentary based on the Christopher Hitchens book, The Trials of Henry Kissinger. And it was one that kind of was eye opening a little bit, just how well thought out everything was. And there's backdoor deals and and then it makes you wonder, you're like, holy shit, like even though we talk about North Korea being, the people being completely just brainwashed by the media, we're not that much different here. It's like how little we know about why we actually do things. And we sell this idea that, America's this great freedom fighter who goes around, helping countries and we don't flex our muscles. We go around helping countries and then people can make their own decisions. It's like when Obama was at the EU, he said he had that speech and he was talking about, oh, we went to Iraq so then people could, the people of Iraq could have their country back. And I'm like, I'm like, if anybody believes this shit, I'm like, it's insane the stuff they feed us.
It's in the nature, I think it's in the nature of empires. I mean, it's in the nature of peoples in general, but specifically of empires. All empires need their mythologies, and they need their mythologies in order to justify their continued imperial ambitions and their continued exploitation of other people and other regions and other nations. And if you look at the history of Rome, for example, and by the way, since we talked about podcasts, if anybody hasn't listened to Mike Duncan's The History of Rome, you're missing one of the best history podcasts ever made. 200 and whatever episodes it was. But anyway, if you examine the history of Rome and the need for Roman exceptionalism and Pax Romana and the creation of barbarians and what barbarian as an archetype and as a concept meant to Rome, to the civilization itself, the existential threat to Roman culture and Roman heritage and Roman power and all of these things. And then you transplant that to today, it's exactly the same. It's literally, it's the same psychosis. It's an imperial psychosis. And I certainly don't mean to say that the United States and Rome are the only examples, or the West and Rome are the only examples. I mean, we could look very, very much so at a lot of the mythology surrounding the Soviet Union, or if you want to go further back, look at the mythology of the Ottoman Empire, or of the Nazis for that matter, or of almost any empire that you could think of. They create their mythologies in order to justify their actions. And so the America, the home of the free and the brave, and fighting for democracy and blah, 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 all of this nonsense, all of that garbage is our collective mythology, and it is designed to further what I would consider to be the delusion of American exceptionalism. And American exceptionalism is at the root of American imperialism, and there's no way of extricating the two.
Yeah, yeah, and I think that that's better seen from other countries. I have family in Portugal that I talk to in France, and they talk about that, how it's just we make America seem like the land of the free, and it's the only country that we care about fighting for what's right and all this stuff. It's like Rocky against the Soviets and these movies and everything that we're sold. And that's the thing about nationalism that kind of scares me. It's the idea. There's this band I like, Enter Shikari, and in one of their songs they're like, fuck your borders, fuck your flags, fuck your boundaries, something along those lines. And I remember just thinking to myself, I'm like, wait, what the fuck? What are they talking about? And you really think about it, you're like, we don't need borders. Like, what happens is that we just find more and more ways to separate ourselves when, like you said, like the most important thing is human rights, and it's looking at people as people. And I've made the example in the past where you'll get somebody who we separate ourselves by our religious beliefs or political beliefs or our nationalities or skin color or whatever, but our instinct is, if somebody's hurt, if you see somebody get hit by a car or drop their shit at the mall, you go and help, and I feel like, that's our instinct. And if you take away these boundaries and these borders and all these things that separate us, and nationalism and all this stuff, I feel like in deep inside that our instinct is to help people, and we really don't give a shit about any of those other things. It's really just molded and built so, and then we can kind of keep us separated and have a reason to go to war and a reason to dislike somebody. And then there's a need for the empire to keep us safe. So
I think that that's true. I think that that's true. I would also say though that there are other forces at work that need to be considered. For instance, I think that one of the principal conflicts that is absolutely fundamental and inherent to capitalism, but not purely to capitalism, really inherent to all economic systems that I could think of, at least in their practice, is the notion of class and class conflict. And class conflict is fundamental to understanding how these problems, why they exist, and how they continue to plague humanity. And that one of the things that you come to realize, particularly when you study Marx, but also Gramsci and many other post-Marxist scholars who also were interested in class and class struggle and class conflict, is the notion of interests and conflicting interests, and how the capitalist class, that is the owners of capital, versus the laborers, the workers, those who must sell their labor, coming back to this idea that I mentioned earlier of the commodity. The laborer must make himself into a commodity to be bought and sold, his labor being what it is that he can offer in the marketplace. That fundamental divide is really at the heart of a lot of these problems that we're talking about. And so when you look at them from a systems perspective, you have to keep in mind these fundamental divides. And it is not just nations, it's not just borders. Remember that what is the fundamental difference between fascism and socialism or communism? The fundamental difference is that fascism seeks to erase, by virtue of capital and government coming together, erase the class conflicts, to suppress them in the interest of the state. That is what National Socialism means. And actually, you could go one step further and talk about Mussolini's corporate state and the fascio, the word fascism coming from the word fascio, meaning the bundle or the union of private capital with the state, with the government. And that is the nature of fascism. And that is precisely what we're looking at in the West and in the United States today. Does anybody who is serious about looking at the issues of our time doubt the fact that private capital and government are one and the same, that they exist as one seamless entity, or at least, at the very least, two entities so closely connected, so closely intertwined as to be almost indistinguishable from each other? That is the nature of fascism, and that is distinctly different from the notion, at least as formulated in the theory of socialism, where you have a class conflict, class war, where one class must rise up and overthrow another class. Now, you could go into all of the bastardizations of that, and Soviet style communism as being a complete corruption of that notion. I mean, that's all absolutely true. But just from a theoretical perspective, that is a fundamental difference, and that is a difference that has to be understood, and it has to be incorporated into our worldviews if we're to have any hope at all of coming up with solutions to the fundamental problems of our time.
yeah, and I think that people use those words without really knowing what they stand for, what they mean, or the philosophies behind them. When it's fascism or even communists. It's like you hear people say the word communist all the time, and people not even really knowing the ideas behind it or whatnot. So I think that it's important to kind of look at all that stuff. I mean, one thing that I can tell that you're really into is just all different types of philosophies of things. And is that something you try to do? You try to kind of look at things from all aspects and read maybe even philosophies that you don't even agree with, but just to kind
Oh,
of.
absolutely, absolutely. Are you kidding me? I spent time reading Murray Rothbard, for Christ's sake, and I find it to be utterly detestable. I read and study as much as I can about as many different, not just ideologies and systems of thought, but historical perspectives on as many different things as I can, in order to not only be able to grasp things at a deep level, but to be able to understand the difference between how people see the same issue and see the same conflict. And I think that many of the issues, like we're coming back to this point of my departure with some of my libertarian friends, and I'm saying friends not just as a euphemism. I literally do have libertarian friends, even though we have just the most vehement and vulgar disagreements about all kinds of stuff. But where I find similarities is in the notion of fighting against entrenched systems of power, systems of oppression and domination and coercion. My part of my own political evolution, I've gone literally all across the political spectrum, from radical left-wing anarchism to dabbling and reading anarcho-capitalist stuff and libertarian stuff and socialists and Marx and all kinds of stuff. And what I find is that to have a nuanced understanding of these things, and to have a systemic, and that's really, I guess, the key word I'm trying to get across, a systemic understanding of these issues, it is absolutely critical, because otherwise you're just recycling the talking points of other people who came before you.
Yeah, I definitely agree, and that's why I think philosophy is so important. And just reading. This podcast, I've had a lot of people on here, just like Roger Stone, who I mentioned that I don't always agree with, but I think it's important to have those conversations, and I think it's important to have conversations with people you don't necessarily agree with. I think that obviously if you're having a debate with somebody who, if it's one of those CNN debates where you just have somebody from the left and from the right, neither of them are trying to learn anything, but they're just there to kind of defend their point of view or their political party, then those are worthless. But I think that there's a lot of learning that can come from conversation and debate, and as long as it's with somebody who's willing to listen, and willing to kind of bounce ideas off each other and progress in that manner. So yeah, I think that's all really important, just to even question your own views or what you believe in and whatnot. And I
Oh,
constantly do it.
look, anybody who is stuck to one system of thinking is incredibly narrow-minded, in my judgment. I mean, like I said, I have fluctuated all over the political spectrum, and I will also say that those people who also, who have similarly done that, and who say that they reject the idea of a political spectrum at all, that it's all a system of control. This is obscurantism, I think. It's a cop out, in my opinion, because what they're really saying is, well, I have my own ideology that I've cobbled together out of many different things, and it is mine, and I'm unique, and I defy categorization. Well, not really, because trust me, anything you've thought, other people have thought before you. And so it's not about trying to carve out a niche for yourself and stake it out as your own little island, as your own little territory. It's about understanding the progression of systems of thought in order to incorporate many different systems and many different understandings into a broad one. And I have in recent years, I've returned to reading a lot more Marx, because that's exactly what Marx was interested in, particularly in Capital. It was a not just a critique, like railing against it, but it was an examination, taking apart piece by piece the way that a capitalist system works, down to its most fundamental element, that of the commodity. And it's like talking to somebody about about physics, but they refuse to go down to the level of the atom. Well, how could you understand the first goddamn thing about physics if you don't understand how atoms work and what electrons are and subatomic particles and all of these other things? How can you understand how anything works if you don't reduce it down to its fundamental elements and build up from there? But a lot of people, I would say most people, are unwilling to do that, because it forces them to interrogate their own biases, their own preconceived notions, and their own worldview. And when you interrogate your own worldview, oftentimes what happens is it falls apart around you. And that's very scary for a lot of people. And it's happened to me a number of times, and it'll happen to me in the future as well. It's all part of the process that I mentioned earlier, learning without limits.
Yeah, yeah, and I think that's you made a very important point. I think it goes to something about identity. You know, it's like you end up, this is your identity. I'm a libertarian or I'm a whatever, and then once you start questioning that, it's almost like now you're not even sure who you are. And like you said, it might turn your whole world upside down. And next thing you know, you're going through a identity crisis. So yeah, that's all really important. And I'm glad that we end up hitting on all these topics, because I think that's one message that I think that regardless who is on the show or whatnot, or who people are a fan of that are listening, I think the most important, I think, thing to put across and keep reminding people is question whatever you believe. And you know what? There's nothing wrong with that, you know. And there's and if anything, you'll only. I mean, my opinions on everything are constantly being molded. You know, I have conversations. Personally, I'm an atheist, but I'll have conversations with religious people, and I'll be like, you know, I'm like, listen, the difference between me and you is that you say you know what the truth is, and I'm okay with the idea that this is my opinion, but my opinion's always being molded. There's could always be more information or more evidence or something that so I'm always up to changing, you know. And I think that's important to constantly take in more information, more perspective, and you know, don't be afraid to change your opinions and keep molding it, you know. So all that stuff is really important. So I know we're getting to time, so I just want to really thank Eric for being with us. He just awesome conversation. Similar like yourself, we probably hit on a bunch of stuff we didn't know we were going to talk about, but I'm glad we did.
Yeah, I thought we were going to talk about geopolitics, and
Yeah, but
all of a sudden I'm waxing poetic about commodities and philosophies.
well, yeah, but that's the cool thing about doing these things, that we kind of, I've said it before on the show. Just like the cool thing about the internet and doing, putting out your own materials, you can kind of go wherever you want and not really give a shit what people think, to the point that, you know, you don't let other people influence on what we should or shouldn't put out. I think that the point is to put interesting people on a show and try to get some interesting conversations. And I think we definitely, did that today. So, regardless of what we're talking about, like I said, well, I'll talk about hip hop, you know, and I'll talk about music. I'll talk about, you know, comedy. I got some comedians coming up, and I think it's important to, you know, just go wherever the conversation takes you and don't restrict yourself. So, and I think that we probably end up having a conversation that, the fun thing is sometimes you end up having a conversation with a guest that they usually are on all, you know, to talk about the similar subjects. And obviously it's probably fun for them because that's why they're into it. But it's also fun sometimes to talk about some stuff you don't usually talk about.
Oh, no
So
doubt. No doubt. I mean, I've been speaking about Ukraine endlessly for couple months now, and my spiel is certainly a well-oiled machine at this point. So, it was good to get a little, extemporaneous, a little freestyle action, today at the conversation.
yeah, definitely. What do you got coming up? So you got anything you wanna share? Any appearances or any podcasts you got lined up or anything?
Well, I mean, right now, recently, I've been focusing a bit more on my writing and trying to publish articles. I'm regularly contributing op-ed pieces at RT, at the New Eastern Outlook Journal, which is a very good journal based in Russia that I'm contributing to as well. I got something that'll be coming out in Counterpunch probably next week. Actually, maybe no, probably next week. So yeah, my writing is really kind of where I'm focusing right now. Podcasts, man, I'm gonna get back to the podcast. I can't say when that will be. And I used to also do an interview series. I know if you heard my show on Boiling Frogs that I was doing an interview show, but for a number of logistical and practical reasons, I haven't been doing that recently. But eventually, most likely, when I get a new computer and some better equipment, I'm going to get back to doing that as well. But like I said at the outset, all of my work, all my appearances, my written work, my podcast, the archive of my show from Boiling Frogs, all that stuff, you can find it at my website, stopimperialism.org. Follow me also on Facebook. Connect with me through there. Again, my name is Eric Draitser. That's Draitser. Find me on Facebook, or follow me on Twitter at stopimperialism.
Yeah, awesome, and definitely do that. Obviously, as my listeners probably know by now, you have really well put together opinions and perspectives, and you know, listening to you talk is almost like a history lesson at times, because you obviously are so and that's one of the reasons we brought up James Corbett. That's one of the reasons why I've always liked James Corbett too, because he's well researched and stuff, and it's fun to talk to people that are so are so knowledgeable with history, because I mean that's kind of your best understanding of today is understanding how we got here, and like you said, everything's been thought before. Some of the best quotes still, they make sense today, and that the reason that is because even though we're using you know, computers and phones instead of riding horses or whatnot, like a lot of human tendencies haven't changed. So
Yeah, you know, now that you said that, and I'm thinking back to what I just said a few minutes ago, and shit, you know, it's escaping me who said the quote. I'm sure as soon as this interview is over, I'm going to go online, I'm going to find it, I'm going to slap myself in the head for not remembering. But somebody, you know, 20th century, you know, social critic was talking about modernity and saying that the curse, the most intolerable aspect of modernism is the ever-present need for newness, for uniqueness, for the idea that what you're doing has never been done before, and that this is such an oppressive way to think about art and think about literature and think about politics and to think about all of these things. There is nothing new in what you're thinking and what you're doing. Civilization has existed for quite a while. Many people have had many ideas before you. The idea is not to always strive towards something new. The idea is to build upon that learning that has come before you and to be part of this thing that we call progress. This is the key. And, you know, the term progressive and progressivism is such a bastardized term in modern political parlance, but the truth is that that is what we're all striving for, or we should be striving for, the idea of progress, moving forward, evolving as individuals, evolving as societies, and evolving as a civilization, as humanity. And if you're not evolving, well, then you're regressing, and I'm not interested in regression.
yeah, you definitely said what I wanted to say, just way better. So listen to what Eric said. That's what I wanted to say. But hey, thanks, Eric. I really appreciate it, man. Hopefully
Cool.
we can get you on again. I know you're a busy
Sure.
man with all your appearances and stuff. But hopefully in the near future we'll get you on again and bullshit a little bit more. So
No doubt about
eh,
it. Thanks for having
hey,
me.
thanks, and good luck with your writing and everything. And you know, and we'll see how this Ukraine thing turns out, and this Russia thing.
Right on, Ricky.
Hey, thanks, Eric. Have a good one. I appreciate it.
Peace.
Peace.
Believe in the ripple effect.